What is up, Baton Rouge, and welcome back to the Tiger Pride podcast presented by 225 Magazine. Vacation mode. I'm over in South Carolina. Jerit's dressed like he's in South Carolina. Dude's looking fresh with that beachy shirt going. So last week we brought you the LSU Offensive Preview. This week we're going to look at the defense a little bit, but we'll start with some of the biggest news that's come out from LSU this week. And obviously, since we're recording this as soon as possible to it being released, there's inevitably going to be news that drops between now and tomorrow or whatever. But going back to Coach O's press conference, first, let's start with the he kind of mentioned in passing that everyone on the team has had COVID or most of his players have had it. What was your, thoughts on that kind of comment and how willy-nilly he sort of passed it off as?
I feel like the place that I stand on that whole issue right now is somewhere between how casually O mentioned it and how ridiculously some national media members, some of the usual suspects reacted to it. Because ultimately, your Catholic high guy, Matt Moscona, kind of went off on like a 10-minute rant about it on Tuesday. Ultimately, people are going to be exposed to it. We already knew several members of this football team had, either tested positive at one point for COVID or certainly come into contact. Obviously, when they got back to campus in June, there was that outbreak related to Tigerland, and then a couple of weeks ago, there were several, a good chunk of players who were out of practice for a while. We talked about them being down to just 2 or 3 offensive linemen who were available at that point. Mm-hmm. And so it wasn't as surprising to me as I think it was to a lot of people. And to O's point, the positive takeaway is that now all of those players who have, under these tight circumstances, dealt with COVID and not theoretically infected other people outside of, just those close people, that they were able to then keep it under wraps, quarantine those groups and get through it. Now they have the antibodies for potentially 3 months to be able to better resist getting it again. And so that may help the team ultimately manage some of this season and not miss, whereas if they hadn't already had it and been able to get through it and shake it, they may be more susceptible once these games start. And I think that was maybe mistooken some from the national media as though they were excited that everyone had it and looking at that as like a competitive advantage or something. And I don't really think that's how he meant it. I don't know that he necessarily worded it ideally.
Yeah.
But I'm closer to his level of it's fine and it's kind of expected than I am the backlash that came from a few talking heads up the East Coast.
Yeah, I think the biggest like you said, the biggest oddity of this whole thing was how casually he mentioned it. And it's not necessarily a great look, but I don't think LSU is alone in this boat. I think a lot of college football teams are in the exact same situation. Their coach may not just say it in their weekly press conference like that. But I think overall, yeah, like you said, a lot of the players have the antibodies now. They've been through it. And then you even see some kind of, trickle down. Nelson Jenkins has opted out for the season. Neil Farrell is now back in, who was the first one to opt out. So this all kind of happens in the same week that Coach O mentions all these players have it. And then now Tyler Shelvin is reportedly considering coming back after he had opted out. So I guess, first of all, your reaction to Nelson leaving, and then we'll get into Neil Farrell, then that'll kind of move us into the whole defensive preview and D-line.
Yeah, so the only thing shuffling harder right now than the LSU defensive line roster is the national football schedule, where we see postponements and cancellations every week. And I think we talked a little bit about it last week with the offense. That's going to be somewhat of a norm. I don't know that we see cancellations necessary in the SEC if there's a conference that survives this fall without, having to deal with full-blown postponements and cancellations, it would be the SEC. But I don't know that we don't. I think on the national scale, we're going to see far more of what we've seen thus far and hear stories. You mentioned LSU not being alone in this. They're absolutely not alone in this, and they're probably in better circumstances right now than the vast majority of their still playing counterparts. And so we need to kind of prepare ourselves for the fact that even though we now have this schedule set, the schedule is going to be kind of a work in progress for most teams around the country moving forward. And seamlessly transitioning into the defensive line depth chart has been obviously a work in progress for weeks, where it's kind of weird games of in and out. Neil Farrell being back is huge.
Yeah.
With Tyler Shelvin opting out, there were, certainly some talented guys in the middle of that defensive line, but having someone with the experience and ability of Neil Farrell thrown into that mix with Glenn Logan, who moves inside as well, and then Big Apu Ika ahead of all those freshmen who are still probably going to have more playing time than necessarily would have been anticipated right off the bat. But it certainly helps to have Neil now as maybe one of the starting defensive tackles sooner than later. Tyler, they talk about still not knowing for sure if he may potentially come back as well. I think Neil has been kind of in the works as potentially coming back for quite some time. Tyler, at this point, as we get into the back half of September, when the last day to add classes at LSU was September 2nd, I think we're getting further and further from that being likely to figure that out and get him back on this team. And then Nelson, a guy that Nelson told me Tuesday morning that he had opted out. And then talking with O for the press conference Tuesday, he said, I haven't interacted with Nelson in 2 weeks. I guess I think he told us he opted out. And so we'll see where Nelson ultimately ends up, if he potentially ends up back at LSU, on the LSU roster at some point, or potentially at another university at some point. But I think right now with Neil back and there's other guys out, you're kind of looking at the closest thing to the plan for this season on the defensive line.
We had said before that if there was a spot that could lose a couple of players and still have the depth, it was the D-line. That being said, the number of guys that they have lost was getting a little bit higher and making that depth seem not as deep. And I think for whatever reason, I feel like Neil Farrell kind of got overlooked last year. I guess behind Tyler Shelvin's massive, and he had a productive year. And then Rashard Lawrence, obviously, a really good year for him as well. But Neil Farrell was super productive last year. He was in all 15 games. He had 46 total tackles, 7 for a loss, 3 sacks, and a forced fumble. So for whatever reason, it felt like him and Glenn Logan just kind of got a little bit lost in the headlines behind some of those other guys. But I think that's a really, really strong duo to enter the season.
Neil, there was a stretch there around, a third of the way or midway through the season that I wrote a feature on Neil, because just keeping up with Pro Football Focus grades for, what those are worth. Neil was one of the highest graded defenders for a good stretch of the season, at times in smaller opportunities. And then when they started to have some injuries and were missing guys for stretches, and he had those 3 starts, he really, stepped in and picked up that slack very well. And so this year and now with the extra year of eligibility, potentially next year, are going to be huge opportunities for him to continue to take those steps forward and build on what has already been a pretty strong progress through his time in Baton Rouge.
Yeah, he always seemed super, super consistent, and it'll be nice to see what he can do with kind of a full year to shine, especially with the move to the 4-3, maybe a little bit more opportunity for rotation there for him. So that'll be great to have those 2 dudes. Let's just kind of take that into our defensive tackle preview. What it seems like it would be Glenn and Neil as the 2 starting guys up front, with Apu Ika, I guess JoJo Evans and Jacoby and Guillory kind of sitting behind them. That seemed like a really strong, good rotation of 6, maybe a couple more guys in there that I didn't mention as the freshmen coming in. That seemed like a really strong up front, and moving to the 4-3, the more bodies you can have in there to to move around, the better. How do you see that kind of depth playing out, and who do you think is going to be sort of the leader of that group come the end of the season?
I think Neal might be really interesting to watch. We'll see how quickly he progresses up that depth chart. I'm not positive whether he ends up being the day one starter again against Mississippi State, but I don't think it's going to take very long. I think those three that we mentioned as returning players, the two seniors and then the sophomore and Apu, are kind of the leaders of that bunch, as you would anticipate, and kind of provide some different looks. Apu is a guy that came into this defense as a 3-4 nose tackle and provides a little bit more beef in the middle, I guess. But with where Neal and Glenn have kind of tacked on and really bulked up because of this transition and to switch inside, they're not that much smaller than him now. And obviously very athletic and played on the ends last year. And so I think the way the position develops is those two seniors are going to be the guys that I see ultimately playing the most of that position, but Apu's going to be nice to throw in there, a little bit of a different look. And then you have the freshmen, as you mentioned, you have, JoJo, the redshirt freshman who played some this past year and did well in some spurts and in some small opportunities early on in the season before earning that red shirt. And then all the true freshmen. Jacobian is kind of the big guy that I think is going to fit well into that, Apu or Tyler Shelvin mold ultimately. And then Jaquelin Roy, a little bit more of the athletic, smaller guy that in a 3-4 probably could have played more outside. But I'm interested to see how he develops over time too, because of the three true freshmen at that position, he's the one that I kind of have my eye on the most, although he and Jacobian bring kind of different things to the table.
It's going to be really interesting to see this whole group. And like, whenever I'm like previewing the season for LSU offensively, despite all the guys they lost, I can get a vision of what I think the offense is going to look like and who's going to fit in where and how it's just going to flow overall. I find it way more difficult to kind of piece together how this defense is going to not only look in terms of personnel, but how they're going to play, how often it's going to go to a base 4-3, but how often is that going to be a true 4-3 as opposed to who they have down and up and all. It's hard for me to picture sort of how this is all going to look. So this whole preview almost seems like just a shot in the dark here.
They'll mix up some personnel packages. I think we'll probably see more nickel by the end of this season when we're looking back. Then we see true 4-3. But you'll obviously see a variety. And I think the defense is going to kind of lead the way for kind of the early going of this season and maybe kind of where they hang their hat throughout the year, depending on how the offense develops through some of those early games.
And a quote from Coach O from this past week, it was a pretty powerful one. It says, quote, "I will say this, we're so much better on defense right now than any part of last season. I feel Bo Pelini coming in. He's brought a new energy, new excitement, the 4-3. Dave Aranda did a tremendous job for us, but I'm glad we're in the 4-3. It's more of an attacking style of defense using our personnel." LSU's defense I thought was pretty good for a lot of last year. There were some, maybe it felt there were some moments that were letdowns, but then you kind of questioned the offense had them up by 40 points. Does the defense, how focused are these guys on defense? But I thought overall they had a pretty good season, and Coach O is saying this defense is already better than any point of last season. So some strong outlook from Coach O on the defense for sure.
Yeah, there was a stretch in November where they obviously had some issues here and there. They had that first half of the Florida game where they couldn't get off the field on third downs, and then there were a couple of points there in November with the second half of the Alabama game, Alabama putting up some points and kind of hanging with, and then the Ole Miss game where people started to get really critical of an LSU defense that was put in a tough situation trying to keep up with that offense and also dealing with more injuries than I think people realized at the time. But I thought their performance was, other than a few spots here and there, much better than they got credit for. And then you see some of the changes heading into this offseason. And as soon as there was talk of switching to a 4-3, you saw defensive linemen get really excited very publicly because they knew they would have more opportunities to get after opposing passers. And so your quote from O kind of speaks to that a little bit. And I think you bring in a guy like Jibril Cox, who's very excited to play at this level and now going to be playing alongside Damone Clark, who gets a bigger opportunity than he had last year when he showed some really high-level potential in his opportunities. Now all those other guys are off to the NFL, and Damone is kind of the leader of that pack, and you bring in other guys like Jibril or now Darren Evans into the secondary who are all eager to prove themselves alongside those few returners. And I was interested to hear a couple of days ago some more fire from Lil Sting than maybe people are used to seeing from him, getting a little bit louder and more talkative. He's usually a little bit more reserved in terms of how he approaches some of that. And so some guys that, whether they are new faces or returning in slightly different roles in terms of leadership, I think there's a lot of excitement for those opportunities and those opportunities within this new scheme.
I wonder is it too late to transition that number 7 over to Lil Sting since they won't have it this year on offense? I don't know. We'll see. You mentioned the linebackers. Let's touch on the defensive ends real quick before we move into that next group. And I think you and I talked about this a couple weeks back. But this also seemed like a position when TK McClendon transferred out, he was a guy who was mentioned as in that group. And now I'm curious to see how this also unfolds here. I know you said Andre Anthony has been pleasantly surprising and kind of grown into that, he's a senior, it's his time to shine. Travis Moore is another guy behind him. BJ Ojulari, a freshman coming in. That group is going to be – and I wonder if they don't move some of these linebackers and get their hand in the dirt. I think you also have some flexibility when you mention the size of, Apu Ika and Jacoby Guillory if you want to kind of beef up that defensive line overall and move Neil Farrell, Glenn Logan out to end and kind of have a heavier package there. But who else do you think on the defensive end side, some of the pass rushers, guys who are going to cause problems for opposing quarterbacks?
Yeah, Justin Thomas was a guy that I thought was going to be maybe one of the kind of X factors of that defensive front now in a 4-3, and he's reportedly over at UAB as one of those departures from this group. Mm-hmm. And so you look at Dre and Trevez at the starting defensive end spots, and I think those are two guys that were very exciting athletes coming out of high school and ultimately ending up in Baton Rouge. And so the opportunity now in a 4-3 as seniors is certainly exciting to them. And I'm very excited to see what they bring to the table. I talked to Dre a couple of weeks ago about, this is kind of the year. He went through some things injury wise and was kind of nicked up at some points. And now he's healthy and ready to roll and be one of the guys that I think this defense needs to be an impact player. And I look now in terms of some X factors, as much as we talk about some of the freshmen at some other places, including the interior line positions, Phillip Webb, BJ Ojulari, and then the JUCO transfer Ali Gay are going to be people that they need to see ready to roll much sooner than later if they want this defense to have the impact that they're expecting and make that transition from where O's talking about them as solid and can be great to actually being great on Saturdays. And so I have a lot of attention on that trio needing to make an impact in this defense. If I'm looking at one that I'm really intrigued to see making that jump sooner than later, I really want to see what Ali Gay does. I think he could be a guy that we're looking at throughout the course of the season as kind of a new name that really made a huge impact.
I'm excited to see the potential of this group. I feel like most years recently when we've gone into it, a preview in the season, you knew that you had a Chase on that you were really high on, or you had Arden Key that you were really high on, Kiki Mingo, whoever it was. You had a guy who can get after the quarterbacks. And I'm just wondering who's going to end up being that guy from this group. And I think like you mentioned, a lot of talent when they're coming into LSU. And now maybe, a little more experienced, healthier than they've been in their career so far. So this is going to be one of the more fun groups to kind of watch unfold and see who sort of emerges at the defensive end spot. Linebacker, I think you mentioned him, but I'm really excited to see Jibril Cox. We got to talk to him for the first time. I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago. And he just seemed like a guy just from all he did at North Dakota State and to bring that over here in the SEC. it's going to be fun. It's going to be fun to watch him. And really, I think Damone Clark is poised. If last year wasn't a breakout year already, he's going to have a monster year. He seems like he just keeps growing and growing. Yeah, I mean, that whole group, Micah Baskerville, that whole linebacker group, I think whoever ends up filling in there, even if you want to drop Jacoby Stevens back down to linebacker, he got that flexible piece. You can also get after the pass. I keep saying that, get after the pass, get after the quarterback. I think you have a lot of options there. And again, what I mentioned earlier, not really having a great picture of how this defense is going to look. I think you just have a lot of names and a lot of talent, and sort of how Bo Pelini pieces all these guys together in these different packages is going to be super fun. And like you mentioned, I think this could be a really strong point. The front seven to me is kind of the biggest question mark. I think we touch on the back end next. A lot of those guys are a little bit more set, a little bit more experienced that we've seen them play last year. But this front seven has a lot of versatility and a lot of talent, and that linebacker group is kind of in the same boat.
For me, watching the roster turnover start, just I guess through last winter, and realizing which guys were going to be heading elsewhere, at least from the NFL perspective, I looked at offensive line and linebacker as two of my biggest question marks, and clearly LSU did as well, and that's why they go get Liam Shanahan and Jibril Cox with those transfers. And I think both those guys, we talked about Liam last week, and same sort of deal with Jibril, have an opportunity to come in and really be key, players and leaders for their respective groups. I look at Damone and Jibril, who has been doing heavy film study with Damone and Jacoby Stevens, which you can't ask for too much better people to be doing some of that extra preseason work with on this LSU defense to get caught up. I look at Damone and Jibril as really being, standout linebackers for this team in the SEC. And then to hear a lot of the optimism about the steps that Micah Baskerville is taking as that third linebacker at the moment is really encouraging for a guy that was so highly touted coming out of Evangel a couple of years ago. You saw him be great on special teams last year and have some moments when he was able to get in there on defense. Another guy that in small defensive portions graded really well, according to PFF. Had a couple moments, the Vanderbilt game, he kind of came up and was probably some of the highlights of his career thus far. And so now he'll have a bigger opportunity to step in there and make some plays. And then just as we talked about with the defensive line, there are other players like an experienced guy in Ray Thornton who could have some opportunities. And then the younger guys in Josh White, Antoine Sampa, and the converted wide receiver Devonte Lee is someone that I have a lot of intrigue in seeing how he transitions. I talked to high school coaches when he was in high school who, as talented of a pass catcher as he was, they said it was much more difficult to game plan for what he did on a meets defense against opposing offenses. And just, very athletic guy that now is in that mix. And as he continues to learn that position at this SEC level, I think could be an interesting piece to watch for LSU later on this year and, into the years to come.
He's gonna be a senior, right? When he transfers over, he's got 1 year, or is he gonna have an extra year after this?
Devonte?
Oh, sorry, Darren Evans.
Oh, Darren Evans will theoretically, he would be a senior this year, but because of the NCAA eligibility dynamic, he gets a free year. So if he plays this year and next year, he's still good.
Gotcha. How do you see Jacoby Stevens fitting into this defense? Do you think they'll use him more at that outside linebacker potentially, or do you think he'll drop back to safety where he was kind of recruited, or do you think he'll kind of be all over the place, not in the same way as Grant Delpit was, but similarly just kind of versatile?
Yeah, I think they'll use him kind of versatilely or flexibly. I mentioned I think we'll see a lot of nickel in terms of having four linemen and then Jibril and Damone, and then Jacoby can kind of play some different roles within that. I think within those nickel packages, you obviously look at Sting as one corner, and then probably Cordell Flott most of the time as that other corner. And then you have the flexibility with the three safeties in Jacoby, Todd Harris Jr., Mo Hampton Jr., and the different things that they bring to the table, as well as some other talented corners in Elias Ricks, Jay Ward, Darren Evans comes into the mix. And so you'll have some opportunities to, maybe you're playing Mo and Jacoby and bring in that third corner, a nickel corner, or maybe you have all three of those safeties that you look at as kind of three different starters, and Jacoby ends up playing more in the box. I think there's a lot of different opportunities there that if I'm Bo Pelini, I'm pretty excited about the possibilities and just kind of having some fun getting creative with some different looks.
Yeah, and I think this defensive secondary for LSU this year is going to be, studly. And it's hard to say better than last year when you lose a guy like Grant Delpit and Christian Fulton and some of these guys who have been here recently. But to have Sting locking down one side of the field is, the best cornerback in football. And then across from him, I think Cordell Flott really came into his own last year, got a little more experience towards the later end of the season. I thought he looked really good. You have Elias Ricks coming in, who they're super high on, the 5-star freshman. Jay Ward also kind of was in a similar boat as Flott, got some playing time a little more and more towards the end of the year. And then you mentioned, Darren Evans coming over, who's a little more experienced as well. That group could be studly. And then it's even going back one more level to the safeties. Todd Harris is healthy again. Jacoby Stevens is in there somewhere. Mo Hampton was in the same boat as Flott and Ward, getting more and more experience towards the end of the year. I thought he had some really, really awesome performances as a freshman. There's so many guys back there, and we talk about the versatility in the front seven. I think you have the same things with this defensive secondary, but this group could be really, really special. And if it all kind of meshes together and you have the defensive line putting pressure on quarterbacks and you have these dudes covering the receivers on the back end, I can see why Coach O is so high on this defense being something special, because that group is talented.
As much as some eyes popped open this week with O's talk about the COVID dynamics, what caught my attention more was this time last year, or this close to a season last year, about a month earlier last year, O talked about the secondary as being probably one of the best in his time at LSU. And this is before Stingley and Cordell and Jay and those guys had played games. And obviously a lot of that was credit to Grant, Jacoby, Christian, but a big part of that was knowing how good the younger players were going to be right off the bat. And so now all of those guys that were a huge piece of that as freshmen are now sophomores, and Jacoby's back as a senior, and that much more ready to help lead this defense and play that many more facets of his role that we talk about as being so varied. Todd Harris, who they were without last year, was a big part of that enthusiasm early last year, and they talked about him as being a third starting safety then. And so now he comes back and is, I think, if not 100% now, certainly close to it and ready to roll. And Mo Hampton now in that same boat as we talk about with some of the truer corners as a sophomore. He had some opportunities when Grant was out last year to get his feet wet, get thrown into the fire a little bit there in SEC play, and expectations of him being one of the standouts on this side of the ball this year. So I think really an awful lot to be excited about of some purple and gold defense this year.
So Stingley led the SEC with 6 interceptions and I believe 21 passes defended. I think he's obviously going to improve this year, but will those numbers improve, or are people just not even going to throw in his direction? Do you think I guess we have to factor in this 4 or 5 fewer games or something, but it almost seems like his numbers, he may have peaked numerically, statistically last year because of he was a true freshman, and now no one's gonna throw to him. Do you think he surpasses any of his numbers from a year ago?
If they keep throwing at him, he will. That's my biggest question, is how those opposing offensive coordinators and quarterbacks kind of approach him, because I look at this year as when we were doing the preseason predictions a couple of years ago after the big interception year from Greedy Williams, and I looked at likelier Grant or Christian, or at that point Kelvin Joseph, coming in and potentially leading the team in interceptions, because I just didn't think they were going to try Greedy as much and give him the opportunities to come away with those picks. And I could see that very well being the case for Sting. If they throw at him, he's coming down with balls. There's no question in my mind about that. I feel like SEC coordinators are smart enough to not do it anymore. I think they learned their lesson the back half of last year where those coordinators and quarterbacks are not testing him quite at the same rate as when he was the true freshman, still there to be tested against, an early round draft pick and Christian Fulton on the other side.
Yeah, it almost seems safer to pick like Flott or Todd Harris or somebody else to be the leading guy for interceptions this year, just because I think you're right. I think they're just going to avoid him at that side of the field. I mean, the dude did not record a stat against Mississippi State because they said wherever he is, just go the other way.
Yeah.
So
you take that side of the field. That's
yeah.
fine. You win 24. Let's go over here. So, yeah, you mentioned those two younger safeties Todd, less experienced, Mo, young. And then, depending on what they do with Jacoby and how some of those matchups play, I wouldn't be surprised to see him lead the team in interceptions. I think one of those safeties probably comes away with that lead by the end of the year. Unless they throw at Sting, in which case 10 games or not, Sting may have 8 interceptions if they try and throw his way.
Yeah, I feel like whatever safety ends up being in there more often will probably end up being leader in interceptions. But like you said, the balls come in Stingley's way. I wouldn't be surprised to see him grab a few of those. I guess the last thing, Coach O touched on the scrimmage and said those have kind of been going back and forth a little bit, offense and then defense. And he threw out some of Brennan's numbers. I don't know how much stock you put into these scrimmage stats, but we're only a couple weeks away from real college football. I guess when you hear him say offense wins one day, defense wins the other day, how much stock do you put into that? And I guess is that a good thing for LSU overall to have it go a little back and forth?
Yeah, you definitely want some of that back and forth at this point, because if your offense is dominating or your defense is dominating time in and time out, you don't know how much that is a sign of just how good that one side of the ball is versus is the other side just that bad. And so kind of trading off and each side kind of giving each other the opportunity to learn some lessons and get better and be tested is, about what you can ask for at this point in the year. In terms of numbers, as soon as O or anyone starts throwing scrimmage numbers my way, it's in one ear and out the other, because those are so ballparked and rough and mean so little, because you don't see the actual situations, even if the numbers are accurate, that it's tough to get much of a read on what exactly that means. But I think to hear that the offense in whatever capacity, whatever numerical value, came back and had a better scrimmage number 2 against that defense is certainly encouraging, because you want to see some positive things on each side.
Yeah, you're replacing a lot on both sides. And then this is the last thing we'll close on is a little bit of special teams action. Obviously, Zach Von Rosenberg going to be the punter. Do you have any concerns with Cade York? He was 21 of 27 on field goals last year as a freshman, 89 of 93 on PATs. I don't know, maybe I've missed it, but I feel like that hasn't been many, if any, questions about the kicking game to Coach O recently. But any concern with Cade? Do you think it's a decent spot LSU feels comfortable with him?
The kicking game came up at one point a couple weeks ago briefly, and O actually left the door open more than I anticipated he would, because I think Cade ultimately had a strong freshman year. He had that little stretch later on in the year where he missed a couple kicks, but it seemed like he shook back and made some big kicks after that. And now coming back as a sophomore, that's a spot that I haven't been particularly worried about for LSU. Looking around the NFL this past weekend, I think a lot of NFL teams would probably love Cade York right now. And I don't know why they haven't called Cole Tracy yet, but yeah, I feel okay about LSU's kicking game. We'll see how it plays out on the field. Obviously, no matter how confidently you feel at this point about any of those positions, things can change once you get into game action and guys are kind of dealing with different things, whether injury or mental or otherwise. But if you're looking for a forecast, I feel good about Cade York as the guy putting the ball through the uprights.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think last year he's got the talent. I've seen all these videos of kicking camps and whatnot. I think last year was a little bit of consistency issues. It was one game he was spot on, a couple, he missed a couple here and there. I think you kind of just work that out, and I think Lsu will be just fine. But I guess they have a few other guys on the roster just in case that competition does open up a little bit more. So we shall see.
Mia, how consistent were you as an 18-year-old in like most aspects of life?
In any aspect of life, I was not consistent at all. So I'm cutting Kate a little break.
Yeah, and you're doing great now. So I mean, it's just part of the learning process.
Just gotta grow up a little bit. So that'll do it for this week's episode of the Tiger Pride podcast. Next week we'll preview LSU Mississippi State, a little Mike Leach action, maybe get some Pirates in the podcast somehow. Be sure to follow Jerit on Twitter at Jerit Roser. I'm on Twitter at Mark Clements225, and all the 225 magazine brands, facebook.com/225 magazine, Instagram and Twitter at 225 Baton Rouge, and of course follow the podcast wherever you get your podcasts, Spotify, Apple, Google Play Store, whatever it is. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.